Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the book discussion. We are meeting today, as usual, the last Friday of the month, to discuss a book by the Central Asian scholar on some pertinent issues. And obviously today is more pertinent than others simply because the case with Kumtor is going on, and a lot of questions, a lot of comments, a lot of fears, and how to read all of this is a very interesting opportunity and a moment. So I would like to welcome our the author and the discussants. So let me just give a short bio of Aliya Tskhay. Aliya is a research fellow at the School of Management at the University of St. Andrews in the UK. She holds PhD in international relations from the same university. Her research focuses on the study of global energy sector, particularly within the Eurasian region, including but not limited to the regional integration processes, the net zero targets, carbon negative technologies, and energy transitions. In her work, Aliya covers topics such as energy security, development of nuclear energy, energy geopolitics, and sustainable development of energy resources. She has taught at the Academy of Public Administration under the President of the Republic of Kazakhstan and OEC Academy in Bishkek. She has also been involved in consultancy projects for numerous governments, international companies, and think tanks. And today, let me welcome her book. Her book will be that we will be discussing today examines the implementation of and the spread of the compliance with the emerging global norms. It's based on the empirical study on the implementation of the transparency norms defined as the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and which is a multi-stakeholder process seeking to promote global standards for transparent and accountable management of oil and gas and mineral resources. It investigates the various factors and motivations affecting actors with regards to norm compliance. The book demonstrates that compliance with global norms depends on a combination of various factors, including motivations, conditions for introducing norms into the domestic political space, local actors' level of commitment to the norm, and their capacity for norm compliance. It's also a pleasure for me to introduce our discussants. Farkhod Aminjonov is an assistant professor at the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Zayed University in the United Arab Emirates. Before joining Zayed University, he was a professor researcher at Narcos University and my co-worker. He's a deputy director of Central Asia Institute for Strategic Studies based in Almaty. He holds PhD in global governance from Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada, and MA in international area studies from University of Tsukuba, as well as MA in political science from the OEC Academy. He as well has been engaged in a number of collaborative projects with Canadian, German, Norwegian, US, Turkish research institutions. He has a track record of publications. His research interests mainly include energy security, specifically security of energy systems in Central Asia, energy and water governance, innovations, pipeline politics, as well as foreign and domestic energy policies. Another discussant today is Medet, who is an assistant professor and the chair of international and comparative politics at the department at the American University of Central Asia. His research and teaching interests include civil society in transition countries, political institutions and politics of ethnicity, public policy and governance. Medet has been publishing works in various international journals and publishing houses, and until 2008, he's been working at Soros Foundation. And before that, he's been a research fellow at the National Academy of Sciences. He graduated in history from Kyrgyz State University and has Masters of Public Administration from Bowling Green University, and currently is a PhD candidate in political science at Central European University in Hungary. So with this said, let me first give the floor to Farkhod. If you remember, our book discussions are organized in the following manner. So rather than presenting a book by the author, we give the opportunity for our discussants to present the book and then ask some questions, with the author having an opportunity to respond to that. And hopefully that will be much more illuminating for our audience. So I would like to give the floor to Farkhod Aminjonov first. Farkhod, the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Assel. Well, I hope you can hear me well. And I have 10 minutes, right? So I have 10 minutes to talk about the book, and also ask some questions, right? That's a that's a tough, right? Basically thing to do. All right, let's start. Aliya, thank you very much. That's an excellent book, really. I actually watched through previous book discussions, and of course, all the discussants, they thank the authors for their excellent job. You know, well, this book is awesome indeed because you spent years working on the book. And I'm not saying this for the sake of thanking you because I know you for years. I have always been interested in extractive industries transparency initiative, right? But I have always been very lazy to look into what this initiative actually, what the initiative was about. And now I really understand what the initiative is about. I can't say that I'm happy about the initiative itself, right? Because I know what the initiative is based on your analysis, focusing on the Central Asian countries plus Azerbaijan and Norway. So talking about the book provides a comprehensive analysis of the initiative itself. The book is, well structured, easy read, provides a detailed analysis of the case studies. If you are interested in theoretical and the conceptual discussion of the initiative itself as a norm and the process, so this is the book that you have to refer to, right? Excellent framework for the analysis of the norm compliance when it comes to transparency, accountability of the revenue, transparency and accountability of the revenue, the revenue information sharing of the resource-rich countries, right? Not necessarily those countries which are corrupt and again, when it comes to transparency and accountability, really lack transparency and accountability. But even the democratic countries, open countries, well-developed countries, they are also members of this initiative. And when it comes to the question of whether the country wants to share this information with the world and be subject to the global scrutiny, right? And why would those countries want to be open to the world for sharing the information, which one would would want to assume be secretive? This book provides a very interesting analysis of the process and the guiding, the guide for why this, basically the whole idea of the push factors for those countries to open this information to the world. Okay, now, when it comes to the methods and the methodology, this Aliya did an excellent job for data gathering. She had the first-hand experience to information access when it comes to those countries, because for data gathering, besides desk research and statistical data, she actually used expert interviews, which provided lots of insights, complementary insights to very useful insights to opening up lots of sensitive issues when it comes to understanding the whole process of transparency, accountability, and the norm implementation when it comes to the extractive industry transparency initiative in the countries such as Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan. All right. So when it comes the most important thing which I found very interesting about the selection of the cases was the reason for the compliance of those countries when it comes to joining the initiative, right? All of those countries, they present unique case. Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Kyrgyzstan, as well as Norway, for joining the initiative. Norway, Kyrgyzstan, as well as Azerbaijan were in the front lines from the very beginning, presenting their willingness and interest in joining the initiative. What for? Norway, a democratic country, already having discovered enormous energy resources, having enjoyed a reputation of an open country. Why would they want to be a member of an international institution trying to release this information, which in fact in that country was already publicly available, right? So what was the benefit for the country to become the member of this initiative? At the same time, on the other end of this, line of logic, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan, the countries not with the best reputation when it comes to openness and transparency. Why would those countries, want to join this initiative? To improve their image, the image which was already damaged, right? Possibly that was one of the reasons presented by the governments. But again, a very interesting discussion was presented in this book by the author in details with facts explaining, again, the reasons for joining this initiative and all those major obstacles those countries faced along the way, from being compliant member, and in some cases such as Azerbaijan, which was downgraded, and at the very end actually forced, by sanctions of this, initiative, actually to suffer the consequences of non-compliance with the rules and regulations of this initiative. The book is very interesting because it follows certain logic and the structure at the very end, providing the way forward analysis, right? So basically what to expect in the future, sustainability of this initiative, and how these countries, what is the future for these countries in this initiative, and also what is the future for the initiative itself, right? Because it's the process which is constantly evolving, which is again something that the author has interestingly emphasized in her book. Now I have several questions which I really want to ask the author, since I have a few remaining minutes here. I have question on the book, like not the book because the book is awesome, but I have a question, general question on the initiative itself, and then a few questions for each of the case studies. As I said, I have always been interested on this initiative, but having read the book, my main kind of concern with this initiative is that for me it was very difficult to see the value of the EITI, right? So those countries which are members of this initiative, some of the countries which are releasing this information, they either would have done it without this initiative, such as Norway, or they are releasing this initiative because they are obliged to. And in case releasing this information is not in their interest, they are not simply doing it, right? And if they are to suffer the consequences, okay, so what? Such as the case of Azerbaijan, right? And if they have to suppress civil society in the country and suffer the consequences, so it be, right? The point that I want to make is that all those countries, they began differently and they ended up differently. So the initiative itself doesn't necessarily provide a kind of a very, a solid pathway, right, as an institution or as a process for countries to enter and improve themselves. They enter, they perform in a certain way. If they succeed, they do. If they fail, they simply either leave or they get somehow punished. They learn the lesson or they don't, right? So again, what I don't see a lot to what has this initiative truly improved those countries in terms of transparency and accountability. If I may, just a few more minutes. Norway, a very interesting case, right? Norway, a democratic, open country. And actually, you mentioned this in your book that, even Norwegians, they question the Norwegian government decision to join. They were kind of founding members, right, of this initiative. Why would we want to become a member of this initiative and actually spend money helping other members of this initiative? It's the burden on us. We are releasing this information anyway, right? So here comes the question. If Norway leaves the initiative, would that really be a negative precedent for the initiative? Would it really push other countries kind of away? Would that scare other countries away? Since Norway being kind of a model country for other resource-rich states, would that really be a negative precedent for others? Kazakhstan, again, right? So that's also a very interesting case, suffering a lot of corruption cases. Kazakhgate, as you mentioned at the very beginning, with high-level politicians involved in there. Being a member of this initiative somehow forced the government even to include the obligations to report the revenues, into the government's grant strategy, which is good. But don't you think it was done for the sake of doing it? That was a political decision rather than a true reform that the government wanted to improve, its resource management, right? So they did it for the sake of doing it, not because, as you mentioned in the book, being a member of this initiative is not just about reporting. It has to go beyond simple reporting their resource revenues, right? And how much they are transferring money to Samruk Kazna, right? And their daughter agencies. It has to go beyond that, which requires another set of reforms. And this part is really falling behind when it comes to Kazakhstan. So isn't it just a political decision, kind of, what we say in Russian, brasать пыль в глаза, or is that kind of a real, how can Kazakh government make it a true resource management reform? You know what? I think I am really out of my time right now, and I will stop here and give the floor to Medet. And I'm pretty sure I will have a few minutes along the way, and I will be able to ask my other questions there. Thank you,
Thank
Aliya.
you so much. Thank you so much, Farkhod. Appreciate it. Okay, so we have Medet. Medet is operating under my name, but it's okay. This is Medet Tiulegenov. So Medet, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thanks, and sorry, as Assel said, you know that I'm not Assel, I'm Medet. The reason is just we have a start of the parliamentary election campaign in Kyrgyzstan. I just was too late to come properly on time and prepare myself, therefore I have to go under the whatever system which somehow gave me the name Assel Tutumlu, but I'm Medet Tiulegenov, so I'm glad to be here, and I'm very much enjoying being part of this conversation, and very much enjoyed reading the book. And I have a few comments related to my personal joys and a few questions and comments maybe. My few personal joys relates first because I met Aliya a few years ago in St. Andrews when she was completing her dissertation, and we briefly discussed her project, which was very interesting. We talked about legitimacy and the norm diffusion and the ITI, and it was very interesting. And now it was a wonderful moment for me to see and be part of this discussion, how I see this project completed to the publication of a book. And congratulations, Aliya, with that. Also, another personal joy for me was also because it was my previous professional life when I was working in Soros Foundation. I was myself thinking about as an actor in all of this, which I've written in the book. Wow, I am one of these internal actors, part of these domestic structures, which he describes early in the early 2000s. And it was also some moments of recollection of memories, what was happening at the time was very interesting for me. And of course, as a person who is also trying to be learning about norms diffusion, it was also a joy, scholarly joy, to read your book, and this especially first chapters about this conceptual and theoretical framework, how you're approaching this was very interesting. And of course, when I was reading chapter on Kyrgyzstan, it was also interesting to read what was how it was captured, this whole case related how Kyrgyzstan was one of those, as you mentioned in your book, cases which joined, but then somehow failed due to the lack of a state capacity, which was, of course, to some extent was evident since the early 2000s when Kyrgyzstan joined this EITI initiative. So these were my personal joys, which somehow was, for me, part of my positive moment of being part of this discussion. And thanks for organizers and Aliya personally for you. Now it's good to see you all again virtually at this moment, unfortunately. And just coming to the book. And again, I'm advising to first to those interested in the area of specific case and issue studies related to ITI, mining industries, and transparency initiatives in general. It's quite an interesting book. And on the second aspect, which is for me very interesting as well, those who are interested in norms diffusion and norms implementation, norms compliance, it's also an interesting book to read because it provides a lot of interesting conceptual, theoretical, but also practical aspects to understand what it is and how it works. And it gives you a glimpse, and very quite a good glimpse into what current literature is about this norms diffusion, norms implementation, norms compliance. And I think that's something which is will be, I think, in at least in the foreseeable short time future, very interesting compilation and review of literature, which will be interesting for those who are interested in this area. So that's my recommendation. And of course, for those who are interested in post-Soviet space related to governance, transparency, and mining, that's also interesting because case selection is also quite good when it comes to Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan. Of course, Norway somehow falls away from this post-Soviet space, but anyway, it's also for those who are interested in post-Soviet studies, when it comes to transparency and norm diffusion, it's also interesting. And what I find interesting in the way how the book describes conceptually, theoretically, this whole set of literature, when it comes to how norms diffusion is approached as something which comes, as the book states, as a tops-down approach, when something comes from outside and the norms are immersed somewhere and they approaching certain countries and trying to penetrate them and then being internalized is one aspect. And from another aspect is trying to see from internal perspective, which is the main focus of this book, trying to see how the countries adopt these norms and how they internalize these norms. I think that's the main thrust of this book. And I think that's for which this book can be commendable for, because I'm not very much maybe an expert on all of the whatever literature related to how norms are being adopted, internalized, and localized in various countries. But I think that could be, I suspect, one of the interesting texts to read about this, especially how adoption of norms, how it happens. I think that's something which those who are interested in this area could find an interest in this book. So from conceptual theoretical perspective, I think that's quite an interesting, because I found very interesting these first few chapters when you discuss how the sets of literature, especially when they divided about this so-called norm diffusion, how something originates somewhere and then tries to reach some other states, and then how states trying to adopt it. And then at some point when you're discussing and referring to various scholars, how in fact it happens interactively when norms originate somewhere and then it ends up somewhere. And it should not be taken either from both sides, as for instance, some norm diffusion literature suggests that, well, it's universally happens, originates, and there is certain critical mass, as you referred to some scholars, happens at a certain point of time, and then it somehow have a tipping point, and then it starts to scale up, and then being adopted. And of course, it's a perspective from outside. And maybe it's a gap in literature which you try to fill in, but I felt also something which maybe hasn't been uncovered very much in your book, but I suspect due to my own maybe lack of knowledge. But anyway, that's something which was not uncovered very much, is that how it happened from inside out, meaning that how from bottom up it's being adopted, and then what are the forces behind those which come from outside in terms of coercion as one of the mechanisms, or persuasion, or some other mechanism which forces norms to come and being adopted. So what happens from inside out? I think that's something which is very interesting in the book. And I would be very interested also, Aliya, to hear maybe your further comments to this conversation. How would you see a follow-up? Because books is already a great accomplishment, but maybe you have some other plans to work on this in this area further. How would you, what you feel in terms of what being left as unanswered questions? Especially, let's say you refer to domestic structures as one of the major concepts in the book. And I was wondering since the beginning, why domestic structures? Because I myself, as a political scientist, I was thinking about, well, political regimes as a concept, maybe, well, something which you can approach in terms of trying to understand why countries adopt or reject something which come from outside. Because I think that could be, your research question starts with the word how. And sometimes I was thinking, can it be asked is why some countries adopt, why some countries don't adopt, why some countries adopt, but adopt in a different way. And maybe they're trying to localize and maybe adapt for the internal purposes, and et cetera, et cetera. And that somehow I was thinking could be related to the regime structure. And that's maybe one of my initial questions in my this starting introductory comments. Domestic structures for me was the first time I thought, again, I'm not an expert on all of that, this literature, maybe someone can say that it's a quite well-known concept, domestic structures, but I was thinking maybe it could be something else. And that's something I thought it was not very much unpacked in terms of what is domestic structures. You referred in your literature review to some concepts and details of this conceptualization, but I was thinking what may explain, and especially your case selection, because you've been describing, well, of course, there is a corporate structure. In one case selection, there is something related to autocratization. In some other case in some other cases, and et cetera, et cetera. But then somehow I thought, well, is it all about how those who rule in a given country, how they control the whole process, what should be adopted or not? And in that sense, it relates to political regimes. But political regimes as such was not very much vivid. So maybe something related, your comments related to the choice of domestic structures as a concept will be very much interesting. And maybe that's something which would complement our understanding generally for those who are interested in regime change, in political regimes, that will help us to understand how norms are adopted and so forth. Then I think what is important, as I mentioned already, is in this book, is this conceptual framework in terms of pushing emphasis towards norms adoption and norms compliance. this internal element, I think, is very much and very interesting. And of course, I understand your cases are quite broad and quite diverse. And maybe given the quite often complexity and limitations of dissertation projects and so forth, it's not always possible to go deep. If you would be working hypothetically further on that kind of project, what else would you explore in terms of understanding? Which factors would explain variations in terms of this adoption and maybe localization of EITI? I know that to some extent you explained it in one of the chapters that EITI is a specific technical process, how you internalize, so how you first commit yourself to that norm, then how you internalize, and then how you trying to implement that norm. But then would that case selection, if you would be working further, if you would have further time to work on that, would you find something else in terms of understanding how this variation happens in terms of variety of domestic, configurations of domestic structures would respond to adoption of that kind of norms? That would be one of my comments, and maybe the last of my comments, since I think I don't have much time left, is related to, I think, one of the conceptual points which you highlight in the book is the critical juncture points. I think it's very interesting because when it comes to various processes, I think quite often we, of course, trying to go away from this linear perspective that certain things go in a regular sequence and then it's spread around and then it becomes universal. There is a tipping point, as I think Seeking and other colleagues are suggesting, and etc. So happens, and then things are being adopted. But you're trying to refer to certain critical juncture points, and I was thinking about that in terms of critical juncture points. And of course, EITI maybe is not the perfect example of trying to show why and how critical juncture points can emerge. But I was thinking in terms of certain macroeconomic shocks and political shocks and etc. For example, you refer, and again, to my beloved country of Kyrgyzstan, these revolutions, 2005, 2010, and this kind of shocks, how it creates a certain demand for accountability, transparency, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But how these critical junctures can be understood in terms of norms diffusion and norms adoption and then norms compliance. Well, of course, norm compliance comes maybe a bit later because critical juncture happens maybe at the early stages than just norms compliance when it happens. But sorry, somehow my memory fails me at this moment. I just recalling one author who was talking about this institutionalist. He was an institutionalist scholar. He was talking about the diminishing return on investments when it comes to critical junctures. And he also, Aliya, you referred to the cost and benefit analysis in your book. When you're trying to approach various actors, how they calculate why it is important to adopt something or maybe not adopt something. And for them, the costs of adopting something at some point, especially in critical juncture points, becomes not so high in regard to certain short-term benefits. And I think these moments are quite important to understand why and how certain initiatives may spread, or maybe they can be stalled and failed. And I think in this aspect, when you talk about the critical juncture points, I think that's also interesting in terms of generalization of your study. How study of EITI in terms of norm diffusion can be applied to many other norms. And why this something which quite often is, I think it was, what was the term, cascade norms diffusion? I think that was a term which was applied by some scholars. How it can be applied in terms of proper timing? Why in certain times certain norms can quickly diffuse and in certain other times they are not diffusing? And I think that's also a very interesting, important question which you try to address and you try to unpack in your text. But maybe if you'll try to dwell on that a bit more, trying to understand, well, what else you can try to work on in terms of critical juncture conceptually, because you briefly mentioned in one of the earlier chapters in the book, but I think that's something which can be further worked on, and that EITI is an example. Although, of course, you mentioned in the beginning already that, well, there were no crises when these 4 case countries joined the EITI, but there were a certain number of certain factors which, when they came together, they somehow made them to adopt that that initiative. But at some point, of course, that some of these countries they failed on that. So I think this critical juncture as a concept, I think that was also a very interesting concept in your book, which somehow helped. I would think for those who will also read this book would also help to think about why certain norms and initiatives which come from outside can help to understand why they can be quickly adopted and maybe internalized, or maybe they can be stalled, or maybe at some point even failed. Maybe at this moment I will stop my remarks and I can contribute further.
Yes, thank you so much. Aliya, you have a lot on your plate.
Yeah.
I mean, really a lot. Thank you so much, our dear discussants. So I'm going to give the floor to Aliya. You decide which questions to pick, because there's so much. I mean, there's the generic ones of the value of EITI, and there are more specific ones. So the floor is yours. So you will have about 10 minutes to respond.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, thank you to Assel for organizing this, and thank you to Farkhod and Medet for reading the book. Thank you, but also for very valuable comments and questions. And I think the way, Assel, do you want to say something on the? No, shall I continue? Okay.
Yeah, you can continue. I'm just trying to see if Zhenibek, can you please mute your microphone? Thank you.
Perfect. I think the way I'm going to approach the comments and the questions is a little bit in the reverse form, because I think if we start with the theory first and we deal with the theory, and then we move towards the case of EITI and the cases of the case studies. And the reason to approach this norm diffusion process is I was interested in very much in understanding how the norms are moved around from the international society into the states, and how the adoption works. But I was from the very beginning very adamant and very convinced that it's not a linear process, and it's not a top-down process. And what my feeling coming into this research project was that there's always these kind of good countries that say like, oh, you should do this and this, these are the norms. And they say like, oh, you know, you have to follow these rules and these rules, and these are the good ones. And there's very kind of that coercive and kind of push for particular norms to be adopted. And you know, you're a good state if you do that, and you're a bad state if you don't. In my mind, the complexity is there, and it's much not a very linear process as some of the scholars noticed. And the EITI, especially for me, was an interesting case to work with, because it's not a established norm. It's not like human rights. It's not anti-mine law. It was an emerging norm. So the norm itself was kind of very nascent, and the process itself was nascent. So it was interesting to look at, okay, if we have this norm that is not necessarily fixed and very hard international law, what can we do with it, and how the process can be different? And actually, it's very rare, I think, in international relations to see emerging norms and to see that process from the beginning, because some of the norms have been with us for way too many times. So for us to observe that kind of initial stage. So in terms of the norm, so yeah, I looked at the literature about the norm diffusion, and Catherine Sicking and Finnemore's work was very informative to me in terms of how to approach it, but it was also the stepping stone for me to establish my own research. So in that way, I think from the beginning, I was also very interested in not sticking to a particular type of states. That's why I wanted to have a variety of different cases within the book and within my research, not to have necessarily, this is the democratic states and this is how democratic states do the research, do the implementation of the norm, or how autocratic norms. So I wanted to get away from that typology, but look at different types of cases and actually see that maybe there are similarities and there are differences across different types of states, and that would be more interesting theoretically for me to understand. Within that, so I have in the book, and I can show to some of the audience, I try to bring my own, here's the book, by the way, to show my own, like a table of how this norm diffusion, norm implementation model, that's how I call it, how this process works. And it's more of a cyclical work, and it's very iterative. So it comes through the process of norm commitment to norm internalization to norm compliance. And there are certain aspects and elements, it's like a Lego complex. So if certain things click together, then you move to another stage. And then again, if certain things happen, then you move to another stage. And you can also go backstage. You can also, so it's not a very kind of one-way street. In that sense, very, very important, and what I noticed again doing the field work was there was a certain moment in time where stars aligned, if you want to put it that way, where a lot of different kind of conditions put in place, and the process triggered. And it was not necessarily a tipping point from a perspective what Zayed and Fenimore are saying as a tipping point, which is like when you have a lot of actors implementing the norm, and that creates a critical mass that then spreads the norm. When you look at each case, it's not necessarily that alliance of different actors together and then coming together and saying like, yes, let's adopt the norm. It was more of a different political or economic or even more general conditions that happened, or a political event. For example, again, in Kyrgyzstan's case, there was the change of the regime, to the change of political regime. Rosa Altomaeva came on, and she had, and also it's very personalistic. And for that reason, I used the term and the concept of critical juncture, because it's more broad and it's more holistic in its understanding of that kind of critical mass feeling, but at the same time of different conditions and different events coming together and then launching the process. Coming to the question about what I would do next, I think work on critical junctures would be a very interesting work to do and explore more, both from the theoretical perspective, but also from the ethnographic and empirical perspective. Because critical juncture is not necessarily well defined, and it's not necessarily well used inside the international relations theory. So this would be something interesting for me to explore further. But I think, especially here in the EITI, I found that the critical juncture was very, very important to discuss. Because if these conditions were not there, and if these things were not there, the process not necessarily might have started. And then might be also the question for further research, or what kind of conditions can be there for a particular state that is not part of the EITI right now, for it to then become a part of the EITI, right? So what should happen for it to join the EITI? It's interesting. It's also a challenging issue to work on critical juncture, because you not necessarily know what to include. Because it could be, as I said, a political event, it could be an economic event, it could be a personality. So the reason why I mentioned, for example, Rosa Altomaeva, because her leadership was very, very crucial in Kyrgyzstan's case. And then when you remove that kind of personality, then the process can crumble. So that's also an interesting point to elaborate within that. To move towards domestic structures, as I said, I wanted to avoid the use of the concepts of political regime, because for me it was very much constraining and then focusing pretty much on the governance structure and the political governance structure, which is important, but it's not the only thing that is important. Domestic structures for me is a combination of things. Is the bureaucratic and the kind of the governance structure, political governance structure within the state. It's also the civil society, and civil society has a crucial role in the ATI. And it's also as general kind of economic and political economic and socioeconomic conditions within the state. So these are very different. These domestic structures are different in different states. They're different, and there could be similarities, but they are also very, very diverse. And it's important to note them of what kind of conditions there are for these, for the bureaucracy to work, because again, the ATI is quite a bureaucratic work. You need to have a very big and very efficient machinery behind taxation regimes, fiscal regimes, customs, and so on and so forth. Laws and legislation. You need to have a very robust civil society as well, and a particular type of civil society that is, expert enough to understand all the complexity of fiscal policies and taxation regimes. You need to have also a particular type of presence of the investors or business communities or oil and gas, and hence, again, for me, political regime would be very, very narrow as a concept, and for me, domestic structures would be more useful concept to cover the issues that I wanted to uncover. On the adoption and localization of the ATI and which countries can adopt that and why. And I think the question why is a very interesting one. And I think this is another book to write on why countries do that. There are several articles, at least articles that I'm aware of, that deal with these questions of, for example, there's one that it compares Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan. At that time, Azerbaijan was part of the ATI. So why Turkmenistan is not and why Azerbaijan is. It's hard to compare, I think, why particular states are in or out. There are different, again, there are different reasons. It's a similar question you would ask to any kind of norms. So why particular states adopt particular norms and why the others don't. So it's a constant question, I think, when you deal with the norms literature of how particular norms are adopted or not, unless they're very kind of universal, like human rights. And even there you have, again, different compliance with human rights law, for example, right? So there are all these questions. About the EITI, I think it's interesting to look at it. So when I started working on this EITI project, it was 2013, so it's 8 years ago. And so much have changed since then, since the inception of the EITI, but also since I started doing the research on it. So the EITI that is now in 2021 is much, much different from when it is started in 2003. And this is coming back to Farkhod's question about what's the value of EITI. I think the EITI itself evolved a lot. And it evolved because it started this learning process from the beginning to understand how it can work, what doesn't work, what does work. Bringing together states and countries and companies and actors from civil society, it was very important, but also growing that geography was also crucial to understand, again, the globality of problems and kind of learning from different countries. And so on and so forth. So another research that I would love to do actually, and that was always my idea after the PhD, which sadly still didn't realize, is to do a research where I would compare EITI countries from Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Europe, in Central Asia, and have a kind of very global view of EITI. And that would be, and again, if I can make like at least a massive project, so you would have at least 20 to 30, there are currently 52 countries that are participating in the ATI. So at least half of the ATI members, and then use the multiple geographies. That would be very interesting to see how it works. Because certainly there are things that the countries learn from each other, because they're all aware and they go to these global conferences every year. But there are also there are things that are different. So it would be interesting to see. And what's the value of ATI? So the value, I think, is that EITI is the only transparency initiative, international, truly global international initiative that works on the revenue side and that try to tackle this issue of openness in the extractive industries. It's the only one that also involves the whole three sectors at its core. So the civil society, the governments, and the companies. And it's very rare to see them all sitting together having the equal voice. And that is very, very crucial. So it's the one actually which is interesting. So when you look at the geography of the EITI states, you look at the countries that participate, but also there are also companies, and there are multinational, huge multi-billion-dollar companies that are involved there, mining, oil and gas, and they are also there. So they disclose within those states that they participate, they disclose their revenues. It's interesting also how the fact that, you know, Farkhod was asking like, oh, what about the states that disclose such information already? Why would they participate in EITI? EITI provides that. EITI provides that visibility and that work with the three sectors that not necessarily can happen. It's also a very standardized process. So it's easier for the public to actually reach. So you just have to download the report and you have all the numbers and all the names of the countries and so on and so forth. It's very, very hard. And trust me, I tried to do such research for many years. It's very hard to go through and finding that information, even if it's available. Because it can be in 10 different departments, in 10 different sources. Something is available online, something is not available online, so you have to make a request. It's a very laborious thing. Plus, you have to understand the numbers, so not necessarily. So, and again, I'm talking about fiscal and taxation, so you have to really be trained in doing that. So even if they do publish that information, not necessarily as a normal citizen, you can actually easily get it. So the EITI provides that more easier access, so to speak. Plus, the interesting point from the EITI, and this is what the EITI as an organization always kept on saying, they focus on the revenue side, so how the revenues are transferred. They don't focus on what happens after, so what happens with the revenues, that how they're used. And this is something that can be done by civil society projects. So you can take EITI as a starting point and then use that data and use that material to look at further areas. So for example, how then that money is used for budgets and local budgets and regional budgets and national budgets, how what kind of involvement there is of different companies in different regions, so in extractive interest regions, and so on and so forth. I think also the case of why Norway was important, that for me, I always wanted to show that it's not necessarily the case that, oh, Norway is good guys and they follow and they're the model. I think here in the EITI, you wouldn't have that ranking system. There's no such ranking system. Indeed, I think nowadays there used to be within the EITI process there would be a compliant state, and then there would be a non-compliant state, and there would be some in between those that need to fix something. They changed that, and I think they changed that for the good, because it's important to understand the complexity of things. So now it's about progress. So whether you do inadequate progress or you do meaningful progress, because it is a process and it's evolving process, and it's a process that evolves within the ITI globally, within the organization and initiative, but also within the state. In that way, there is no a ranking system, so whether someone is doing better or not, but it's a matter of understanding what for the country, for each particular country, is the best. So, for example, for Norway, it was important for them to be part of it, to be kind of like a trailblazers and show leadership in that. But it's also important they learn themselves about their own extractive sector, about how the companies are operating abroad, and how they interact with their own public. Of course, they had these institutions before, but again, EITI gives that kind of floor. And I was very happy to see that actually having Norway there at the beginning actually did give impetus to other European states. So for example, UK now is part of it. Germany is part of it. There is more and more. US was supposed to be now it's it dropped out of it, and I do hope that they will join, because the more countries we have there of so-called the West or democratic, you name it, it's for the better. Because again, a lot of those companies that are multinational companies are actually coming from these states. Then you have big extractive or mining countries like Saudi Arabia or Australia or Canada. They're still not part of the ATI, and this would be a good moment for them also to step in. Whether Kazakhstan did it for the sake of it, not to reform, I think it's a question also related to what do you make out of it? What do you make out of the ATI? Because you can follow the rules, but at the same time, it's nowadays in 2021, it's much harder just to follow the rules, because the rules got stricter and they're more specific, and there's a very more detailed understanding of what are the expectations. So even if you want to do it for the sake of it, I don't think you can. And hence, I think the case of Kazakhstan especially was interesting for me to see, is that maybe at the beginning there was a reputational idea, and it played well with investors, and it showed the commitment of the country to these issues of transparency and accountability. But then you soon understand that it needs requirements, to follow. And then you can, in the pathway, you can see how much actually the ATA process helped the government to understand better how to utilize the resources. There's new legislation, for example, there's new code on subsoil and subsoil use that was launched in 2017. That was all part of the discussion and reiteration throughout the ATA process, so that kind of went parallel. So I assume my answer to that would be there are actually reforms that somehow kicked off from the participation in the ATA. What also is important then, I think the case of Azerbaijan is very interesting. What Azerbaijan does is not part of the ATA anymore, but it does publish their own reports, which follow kind of, they publish reports on the revenues, but they don't follow the same regulations as the EITI. And that's something that is interesting, because EITI regulations now, for example, include gender aspects and gender representation in the extractive industries. And they also focus on beneficial ownership. And they also focus on the environmental aspects. So the area of items that are involved in the EITI is also growing. And that's what also it means why it's important to be part of the EITI, because you want to be at the progress of like learning more, expanding more, and getting more data from the EITI process, which for some of the countries would not necessarily follow anymore. So again, coming back to that question of like, oh, what some other countries would publish this information, not necessarily in the same form and not necessarily in the same report. I think I'm rambling. I could see that there are some of the questions also coming in. So maybe shall we use another round of F questions, and I can also reiterate some of the points.
Yes, thank you, Aliya. Yes, just because we're over the time, just very quickly, just to give the audience an opportunity to ask a question, let us collect one or two questions. There is a question from Malika. Malika, could you please, verbalize your question for the audience? And also, is there anyone else? It's your chance now to ask a question. No, then thank you. Malika, could you please,
Yeah, Aliya, congratulations. It's really a great achievement. Do you think there is, could you please unpack the concept of global norms? Because I kind of have a problem with this concept. Like, is there actually, aren't they actually Western brought or Western born norms? Can you please maybe discuss it? I'm not sure if you discussed it in the paper already, in the book already. Thank you.
Great question. That's exactly the point which I want to avoid is I don't want to be using the concept of Western norm necessarily. The norms for me are not the ones that are kind of coming out of a particular set of states. Let's put it like that. And EITI is a truly global norm because it's a norm that has been coming up for a long time, but also it's a norm that is absorbed and galvanized by different type of states. So by the Southeast Asians, African states, Latin American states. So it's a very truly a global norm. And I think the point of for the way I look at the global is representation. So what kind of representation you have and the applicability. So where would the norm be applied and in which area? And in that way also, you can take a step forward in actually claiming that transparency and accountability norms are universal because they should be universally applied, as well as human rights should be universally applied. So yes, I would say that EITI is a global norm because it's applied not all over the world yet, but it's truly is in terms of geography is global. But at the same time, I think the aspiration is that it would be universal.
Well, thank you very much, Aliya, for the your, I think, very interesting answers and the discussion. And I thank Medet Tiulegenov and Farkhod Aminjonov for joining us and discussing the book. And thank you everyone who joined us today. Yes, we need to finish now. And yes, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Thanks, you, Aliya.
Yeah, thanks.
Great book.
Super.
Thanks all.
Bye.